This week's surveillance report covers many new things regarding Linux's rough run of vulnerabilities, including a brand new vulnerability that dropped today at the time of recording. This has a 20 million person Palantir built database that you need to know about, and Android has some good and bad news I would like to cover with you, plus the usual data breaches, threats, and open source updates that we normally cover. Welcome to the Techlore Surveillance Report, which is your essential weekly tech news delivering deep analysis on the latest threats to security, privacy, and digital freedom, empowering you all to reclaim control and defend your rights. All right, so last week we talked about that Linux exploit called copy fail, and many of you rightfully went into the comments and said, hey, Henry, there's actually already a new vulnerability that happened last week. Well, guess what? This time I actually caught the third vulnerability as I'm talking about the second one. So we're going to talk on that third one in a second here, but just to update you all, Dirty Frag was the second exploit, which is part of the same overall family as the first one, but they are distinct vulnerabilities, right? They're not the same exact one. In terms of what it does, this mainly targets servers, and it's going to allow low privilege users, including those using virtual machines, to gain root control of servers. Microsoft has even spotted signs that hackers are experimenting with Dirty Frag in the wild, and so this is definitely something that you need to keep in mind and try to get patched ASAP. Now, Ars talks about how this is quite scary because it's deterministic, so it works precisely the same way each time it's run and across different Linux distributions. So it's not like one distribution is more immune to this attack than another. It causes no crashes, which makes it stealthy to run. Now, by the time you're all hearing about this, several distributors have released patches, so like Debian, Alma Linux, and Fedora. And so it's very important that you get that information from your distro. If your distro has not been communicating about either of these exploits in the public and you don't know if they've actually patched them, that is a big red flag. These are massive Linux vulnerabilities, and every single Linux distribution should be quite public and transparent about whether or not they've patched this yet. Now, Ars Technica at the bottom of their article, and you can find all these in the show notes as always, does say the best fix is to just install the patch immediately, and they have additional guidance from some researchers who actually did a lot more coverage for this, which I'll also leave in the show notes. I am catching the one that's about to drop before I go live. So this is the third vulnerability now, which is Fragnesia, I believe is how you say that, was made public as the latest vulnerability. This is another local privilege escalation exploit that is of the same vulnerability class as Dirty Frag, which was also considered part of the same family as Copy Fail. So these all seem quite similar. Now, this one's very new. Again, it dropped today, and so there's actually a lot less awareness and publicity around this brand new attack. So that, yeah, guys, this is the third one, just so we can keep up here. There is a 2-line patch that they say for addressing the issue within the Linux kernels, but hopefully, maybe even by the time you start listening to this, we'll start getting more updates. This is very fresh. This is very new. So by the time you're all listening to this, you might want to go and check right now to see what the status is right now. Now, in last week's report, I started getting some questions from you all that I wanted to address to share some of my thoughts. I saw some people mention, well, some people were attacking Linux and saying, oh, you see, this is why Linux is blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, no, these vulnerabilities can happen on any operating system. We do see Windows suffer a ton of vulnerabilities like this. These are all just things that happen with software. Now, I think the main thing to watch out for, and I covered this last week as well, is the overall response, the frequency, the history. Those are the questions that actually point to the long-term trust that I'm looking for in my software. So I'm looking to see, okay, is this happening on a weekly basis? No, it's quite uncommon, except these last 3 weeks, apparently, where we have 3 vulnerabilities, all of the same class. But let's say this kept happening, right, every week for the next 2 months. It might get to a point where I would start distrusting the security and the way that they're handling this. And in those people's defense, there are kind of responses to this that I'm not happy about. I think that these vulnerabilities do expose the inherent weakness in the overall model of the Linux ecosystem, which is everybody has their own distribution. And so it's very possible at any point in time that if you're not, if you just don't happen to be on a distribution that patches things the fastest, you're getting left behind until your maintainer actually fixes the code. Compare that to something like Apple. If they find a vulnerability in their software and they push out an update, a news article just says, hey guys, the update's live, update, boom, we're done. But in Linux, you have to find a list somewhere. You have to see if your specific Linux distribution has actually patched these issues and which of the issues they've patched. Have they patched all 3 Linux vulnerabilities? You're going to have to find out for every distro. I do think that is an inherent weakness to Linux, but that comes with the open-ended ecosystem. I also saw kind of some of the inverse comments, which are people saying this is great because it's open source, people are able to find these kind of vulnerabilities, and it's possible that these vulnerabilities are actually existent on other operating systems as well. Again, there is truth to all of these things. I think the open source nature and the transparency of Linux does make it easier to find these things, but these kind of vulnerabilities are also possible to find on proprietary operating systems as well. So I don't want to oversell Linux either. I just want to try to be as balanced as I can when covering this news. I think any operating system can suffer these kind of things. Make sure you're getting patches on all of your operating systems out there, and we'll keep following this to make sure that everything is still good. All right, the next story is a bit of a politically charged story. So I'm going to try to not make this left versus right, but I know that inevitably I won't do that perfectly. So I'll try my best to cover this. But really what I want to target here, so the story and the way this is communicated has to do with ICE agents who are carrying around phones that can essentially look up just random information about 20 million people. And it sources all of this from PALENTIR software. Right? This is Peter Thiel's company with just this absolute beast of a surveillance machine backing it. It is a very scary piece of technology. What I really want to speak to here is the privatization of such sensitive data, right? Ideally, in my perfect world, if the federal government needs to be going after people and they want to do so using any kind of information gathering, I would say they need a warrant for that. That is actually what the law says. And there needs to be some kind of transparency. There needs to be a way that we actually get this data in a way that's not exploitive to people and people are aware of what's actually going on. That is actually my real concern with this. And we see this all the time. We see these court cases where law enforcement actually isn't allowed to get a certain piece of data. So instead, they purchase it from a company that is allowed to get it just because law enforcement doesn't want to get a warrant for it. And so this isn't quite that same situation, but I think it's really important to speak to how this information is gathered, the surveillance economy behind it. And I really like the way that Gadget Review puts this here, which is when enforcement capabilities expand through devices indistinguishable from your personal iPhone, the line between consumer technology and state surveillance becomes effectively invisible. And I think that's really the long-term concern I have here. So really, I want people to think about this overall economy that's fueling these kinds of tools, how it's possible, and the lack of ownership that we as individuals have as that part of the equation. And that is really what I'm quite concerned about as I start seeing more stories like this come across my desk each and every week. All right, we have some good and bad news on the Android end, which I want to touch on in just a second. But I actually, instead of a sponsor segment, I have just a few announcements I want to share with you guys about the podcast before we just get into the rest of the episode. First thing is I've kind of updated the template, and you'll see this very soon. Internally, it's a V2 surveillance report template that I'm using each week. And you're going to see it because now the defense bulletin at the end is broken up into a few subsections. So that's going to be the data breaches, the threats, and the FOSS plus updates subsections. Yes, I've seen your guys' comments. A lot of you have requested this ever since Nate left the podcast. You guys want the open source section back. So I've honestly, it's still a lot of the same stories. We've been still covering open source updates on this podcast, but pretty much we're bringing in a few more sections just for that defense bulletin at the end. Data breaches are what they sound like. Threats are kind of covering things that you should be aware of that are targeting people out there. And then the third thing is just kind of the FOSS updates. Second announcement out of 4, we are now doing video podcasts. I think we're one of the first, I'd say first relative to a global podcasting world, but I think we're one of the first podcasts to actually do video on Apple Podcasts. So we're now doing video, of course, on YouTube. We've always been a YouTube first kind of podcast, but I really want to make sure we're still prioritizing those audio listeners. And so now you're getting a video feed in RSS. Some people in our Signal group have already confirmed it works inside of AntennaPod. We're also on Spotify with video. We also have Apple now with video. So I hope you all enjoy this new video experience. The third change is an internal change that I'm hoping downstream is a good change for you all. Behind the scenes, we have a bunch of projects that we manage. We have 2 podcasts, including Techlore Talks, not just surveillance report. We have our course that we're working on. We have these mini series that we're still producing back here. We have our normal video content. We have our newsletter. We have our website. We have our tools. We have too much to manage back here. And so what I wanted to do to build in a little bit more consistency for surveillance report is to lock in a specific day for it for us internally, which is Wednesday. So today is Wednesday. Today is our surveillance report day. There is nothing else formally on my to-do list except surveillance report on Wednesdays. The idea here is that we really want to get back into that Wednesday cadence so that you all actually receive the surveillance report every Wednesday. So I'm hoping that us doing that can also make things a bit better for you all, and you know when to expect the next episode. The last and final change isn't really anything new for you all who are already listening or watching Surveillance Report, but we have had a newsletter called the Digital Rights Digest on Techlore. It is a weekly newsletter that you get in your inbox. It's completely free. It's meant to be a 5-minute read that you just get a TLDR on all the major stories, and then you can move on with your day. Behind the scenes for me internally, what was going on was it was like the same stories as Surveillance Report, and there was a huge amount of overlap. And so I'm just rebranding the DRD, which is the Digital Rights Digest, to just be the Surveillance Report newsletter. So that's shipping alongside every episode, same stories. It's just kind of a written form. So if you like these podcasts and you just want a quick TLDR that's part of the newsletter, join it down in the description. Again, it's the same newsletter we've been doing. It's just going to come out Wednesdays now instead, and it's going to be just slightly rebranded to be the SR newsletter. And without further ado, let's start with the good or bad news. I have the good news up right now on the screen, but let's do bad news first, actually. So the bad news actually comes from Mullvad VPN, but it has to do with Android. So context, Mullvad VPN is an open source, privacy-respecting VPN provider. They have a really good track record. They are one of the most, if not the most trustworthy VPN on the market. And they don't do sponsors or affiliates or anything. So I'm saying this because it's just the truth. And they do a lot of studies and research, and they are normally at the forefront of VPN technology. So they've already exposed a lot of issues on the iOS side of things. We are well aware that VPNs on iOS typically can leak a lot of traffic, and there's no guarantee that all of your system traffic is actually going through the VPN as it's supposed to. The problem is now Mullvad has found something not quite as drastic as what you see on iOS, but still quite concerning. So there's a bug in Android 16 that allows any app to leak outside the VPN tunnel. This is called the Tiny UDP Canon, and they link to an actual research article that you can look into if you want to reproduce this yourself and look into the technical methods of which that works. If you are connected to a VPN on Android, you see a settings icon, and there are these system-wide settings to pretty much try to make it so your system always goes through your VPN, and it literally has an explicit setting called block connections without VPN. Mullvad is saying that this bypasses even those settings, and this impacts all VPN apps, not just Mullvad. So this means that you can leak your regular traffic outside of your VPN tunnel on Android. Unfortunately, the Android security team closed this, and they said they're not going to fix it, which is crazy. There's actually a linked article here. There's an issue tracker on Google's website. Apparently, you have to acknowledge their terms of service. Access is denied to this issue. Okay, I don't know what's going on there, but I can't access the issue. You guys saw that on screen. Now, Mullvad specifically cited that Graphene did patch this. Graphene was also impacted by this, but they did patch it, which is really good news. I don't know if Google plans to. I guess we'll see. If you are using a regular phone that's not Graphene, there is a mitigation that Mullvad does reference. So it just requires an ADB command. And so you can run this yourself. Again, go in the show notes if you want to see how to do this yourself and you want to avoid this from ever being a problem on your device. Now, Henry, what's the good news, you're wondering? Well, I think this is good news. I like these kind of features. If you're not going to use this, and you're not going to use this, but I think this is genuinely an important thing. So Google has launched a new Android intrusion logging feature as part of its Android Advanced Protection Mode, which they're calling AAPM. This is pretty much supposed to be for digital forensic researchers. This is really targeting the spyware space, right? Like we see lockdown mode, we see Apple try to target this and give people actual defenses, and we see lockdown mode as a result of that. Android has, I think, been trying to catch up with this. So we have Google's Advanced Protection Program, which have now recently started launching as part of Android Advanced Protection Program to add some more Android-specific features to give people more protection on that front. Now, if you're curious for what this feature does broadly, they cover this in the article. It activates theft detection lock and offline device lock. It also has USB protection. It turns on and prevents Google Play Protect to be disabled, and it blocks installation of apps from unknown sources, which is called sideloading. Now, there are actual reasons for some people to enable this feature, and that is separate from Google's overall broad attacks from getting anybody to install whatever software they want on their device. aka called sideloading. So I definitely want to be clear here that there are different target demographics for these different features. They also enable memory tagging extension, which is designed to detect and protect from memory corruption attacks. They also disable 2G connections, and there's a few other things that it does. But now they've added this intrusion logging, which just makes it a little bit easier to be able to see if something actually happened to your device. It tells you about security events, it tells you about DNS and connection events, and the article is a lot more technical if you're somebody who has a higher threat model and you think you might have to use this for one reason or another. This kind of means that there are three approaches for these like more high threat model situations for people concerned about government spyware. We have Apple's approach with lockdown mode, which seems to be quite robust. Apple has made some very bold claims about how they haven't had a single device with lockdown mode ever breached, which is quite impressive. And they just made that claim again a few weeks ago. So that's probably still true. And they've continued to make updates to it. We have Android's approach to this via Google, if you are in some kind of Google ecosystem, which is their Android Advanced Protection mode. And then you also have more of the open source alternative to both of those, which would be something like Graphene OS, or if you're going to try to do DIY something yourself, maybe with another custom ROM. But those are kind of the main three options we have right now for any of you who have, a very high security threat model, and you're more concerned about these kind of situations. If you do want to enable intrusion logging, you can do so in settings, security and privacy, advanced protection, and you'll see intrusion logging there. I believe that is Pixel only, so that is only for specific devices. All right, and now we are going to get into the it's not that completely, but it's the slightly revamped defense bulletin. Again, it's going to cover a lot of the same stories. We're just going to add a little bit of some of the old structure that some of you communicated you still liked. So that's kind of the goal, is to bring back a little bit of that retro organization that some of you enjoyed, to just make that a little bit more familiar again. So the first thing here is the data breaches. So this is the big one. A lot of people have been talking about this, but Canvas. Oh man, Canvas. If you are in the US and you have ever gone to a university, I think even some high schools use Canvas, you've probably heard of the name, but they had a massive data breach. It included a ransomware attack, and it took down so many schools all around the country. Now, here's the thing. They actually have come forward and have been trying to negotiate, and they supposedly paid something to just have the user data deleted. So they've actually been working with the ransomware people, which, by the way, is not what you ever want to do typically, unless it is something you absolutely must do, because it's kind of like this whole thing you see in movies where it's like, we don't negotiate with terrorists. The more people who actually pay the ransomware gangs, the more legitimacy they get and the more likely they are to target in the future. But they're less likely to attack if people don't pay them at all, right? And so right now, what's the biggest update here, which came out today, is that US House lawmakers are getting involved. And they are trying to target Instructure, which is the company that owns Canvas. They want them to testify, talk about what the hell they're doing, and why the hackers repeatedly broke into their systems. This is a really juicy saga, and I think it would have been one of the main stories that I showcased this week if it weren't for the fact that I think the most of it's already passed. Like, I think a lot of people have already seen this now. So it's kind of on the tail end of the main reporting cycle, but this might still have more juicy turns next week. We'll see. Or maybe that was the spark and now it's just slowly fizzling out, but we'll see what happens. Either way, if you are involved with this, make sure to contact your university if they haven't been communicating with you. I actually didn't even know that Canvas was a central organization. I've used Canvas before when I was going to school, and I was always under the assumption that Canvas was a piece of software that was like licensed to universities so that they could host it on their own infrastructure. That was my understanding. I didn't know that Canvas was hosting all of this data themselves, and that actually is a lot scarier to me now knowing this information. At least that's my understanding of how this works. So if any of you are a little bit more familiar with the behind the scenes of Canvas, definitely share in the comments. I'd love to learn. All right, let's keep it going. So the UK has fined a water supplier $1.3 million for exposing data of over 600,000 customers. If you're wondering, it's South Staffordshire Water PLC. If I said any of that incorrectly, I deeply apologize. I am not good with names, just in general. If you're new to this podcast, now you've been warned. If you're not new to this podcast, you already know. If you think you might be impacted by this, as always, check the show notes. That goes for all of these data breaches. The next one is a US bank that has disclosed a security lapse after sharing customer data with, drumroll, AI. Can these be any more original? This comes from Community Bank. Yes, they are called Community Bank, and they care a lot about their community, which is why they're sharing their user data with AI. They're saying it's caused by an unauthorized artificial intelligence-based software application. They said it disclosed the incident due to the volume and sensitive nature of the issue. It's unclear what happened, and they didn't disclose anything, not even how many customers were impacted. So maybe next week we will be able to do a little bit more coverage on what actually happened. Next story is Foxconn, who has confirmed a cyber attack claimed by Nitrogen ransomware gang. This is the world's largest electronics manufacturer. They have factories all around the world, I believe. And they say that North American factories are now working to resume normal operations after this cyber attack. Up next, there is a Spanish fast fashion retailer called Zara that had data stolen belonging to more than 197,000 customers. I hope that they are able to fix these problems and make it right with their customers just as quickly as they're able to sell fast fashion. So I know we have quite a few people based out of Czechia who listen to our content and watch our content. And so leave a comment. Let me know how to pronounce an S with a little wiggly above it. I'm going to say Skoda. That's my best guess, all right? So Skoda warns of customer data breach after an online shop hack. They are a subsidiary of the Volkswagen Group. This is an auto company. They say that it included names, addresses, contact information, phone numbers, order information, and login credentials. But the attackers were unable to access affected customers' financial information. So it's still pretty concerning. If you have purchased something from them in the past, I would definitely look into this story and try to see if there are some mitigations here that you can take. All right, the next section of the Defense Bulletin is the threats. And we have 3 stories in here to kind of alert you and the people around you in your life on what's going on and how they can keep themselves safe from these newest threats. The first one is Windows has a BitLocker 0-day, which give access to protected drives. And there's a proof of concept that's been released. Pretty much, Windows BitLocker is the full disk encryption that ships out of the box for Windows. And there is a proof of concept exploit, which bypasses the encryption. Pretty big deal. Now, these vulnerabilities are called yellow key and green plasma. Now, this researcher isn't happy, to say the least. They're known as either chaotic eclipse or nightmare eclipse, depending on the day that you talk to them, I suppose. They have 2 usernames. They actually disclosed the 2 vulnerabilities called yellow key and green plasma, which is how you can bypass this. And they also have guidance on how to leverage them. And this is all driven by dissatisfaction with Microsoft's handling of bug reports. They also said they will keep leaking exploits for undocumented Windows vulnerabilities. And they even promised a, quote, big surprise for the next Patch Tuesday. So, very fitting username. I guess, yeah, both chaotic and nightmare eclipse. There was another exploit called the Red Sun vulnerability, which Microsoft did silently patch, but never actually, referenced the person who found it. Microsoft responded and said they're looking at this and they're investigating the reported security issues, and they will be updating impacted devices to protect customers as soon as possible. And so we'll see what happens here. But the researcher is not happy. They are not happy. They are out for vengeance. And Microsoft, better watch out. All right, next story is a very quick update from the EFF. This came out a while ago. I think it was like 2 months ago. It was announced that Instagram would be dropping their end-to-end encryption in their DMs. This was always opt-in, and this reminds me of some of these fast food chains that tried releasing like vegetarian patties. McDonald's, for example, I think tried releasing one. They didn't do any marketing for it. Nobody even knew the McPlant was a thing. You guys can look it up. It was a real thing, but they released it quietly and a limited number of stores across 2 states. Nobody got it because no one knew it was a thing. And then they said, well, I guess we got to pull it. And I feel like this is kind of Meta's equivalent of this, right? So like Meta came forward. They said, oh, hey, yeah, we can do this opt-in end-to-end encryption in Instagram. And then Mega bragged about it. They said they were doing this. And now Meta's saying, well, very few people actually used it. So we're going to just drop it all together. EFF rightfully calls this disappointing, and it's just disheartening that they are not standing by encryption in principle. A lot of people, EFF said this, I've been saying this, a lot of people in the digital rights space think that just end-to-end encryption should just be done by default. It is 2026. This is readily available technology. Facebook themselves uses this in WhatsApp, which they also own. They use this literally in Facebook Messenger as well. This isn't a secret technology that Facebook is totally oblivious to. And so they really just didn't want to commit to this. And I think the long-term concern is that this is kind of like the first domino falling down for a service that's choosing not to roll out end-to-end encryption. Speaking of Facebook/Meta, not rolling out encryption isn't good enough for them. They also still want to be across every website that you access, even when you don't have an account or you're not accessing Facebook. So this is a story from Gizmodo. They say that Meta and TikTok are getting your data from state healthcare websites. This is something we have seen for months, years of running this podcast. Pretty much, people have third-party trackers on their website, whether or not they know them, but that's exactly what happened here. So these government-run websites, which a lot of people are using, a lot of Americans are using them just to purchase their health insurance, which is required. So this is something that is required on a government website to the public, and these state-run healthcare marketplaces are literally running big tech trackers on their websites, including those from Meta and TikTok. This includes people's zip codes, their sex, their citizenship status, their race. It's sending it to Meta, Snap, Google, Nextdoor, LinkedIn, and many others. And once they have it, who are they sharing it with? And it's just so frustrating. It even says in the article, it's not clear how much of that information is actually used to deliver targeted advertising to people, but the data may inform the type of content that these platforms serve to users from whom they have collected health-related information. I mean, there are just so many things that are wrong with this, right? Like the state insurance providers should know better. They shouldn't be just serving whatever big tech company trackers they need to serve on their website. There are ways to collect this information privately. So there should be better disclosure. They should have already opted for better services in the first place. Of course, a Meta spokesperson said exactly what you think a Meta spokesperson would say. They said, "We do not permit or want advertisers to share sensitive information with us through our business tools, and our systems are designed to detect and filter out information that appears potentially sensitive. Advertisers set up these tools and are ultimately responsible for the data they choose to share, including that they don't share sensitive data with Meta per our terms." Do you, am I crazy? Meta is saying, oh, yeah, this isn't our intention. It's the advertiser's job to not share that data with us. But if they share with us, it's not our problem. Oh my God, this stuff is just so infuriating. Meta is just such an rotten company to the core. This stuff makes me so frustrated. Now, on the bright side, several states apparently have removed some of those trackers. And if you want to be ahead of this, you should be able to just use an ad blocker that includes tracking protection, or just use a browser with this out of the box. So if you're using uBlock Origin, if you're using Ghostery, if you're using AdGuard, if you're using the Brave browser, if you're using Waterfox, insert whatever browser you're using out there. Ideally, it's blocking these trackers on every website, so you don't have to worry about this anymore. Now, theoretically, these sites can still do things on the server basis, but I don't think that's what's going on here as far as I know. I wasn't actually able to confirm this just from the article, but I'm fairly certain that a basic ad blocker tracking protection thing would have actually solved this for you all individually. But again, this shouldn't be happening in the first place. All right, everybody. And now I'm going to deliver what you all have been asking for months, which is the open source section. Now, I want to be very clear here now, right? All right, this is a compromise because I think there are a lot of updates I do want to share at times that aren't strictly open source. They might be source available services. They might be a proprietary service that has an open source lens, right? So I will be using open source a little bit more broadly than normal, but it is the open source news. It's effectively what we used to do. I just want to be a little bit clear about what that means. And I think a really good way to just describe what that means is this first article. The newest version of iOS, macOS, and iPadOS released version 26.5 and arrives with encrypted RCS messaging and more. These aren't open source operating systems, but these are open standards that anyone can use now for encrypted messaging. So this is quite simple. You can opt into this. It's in beta, and it means that if your person, your friend, your whatever, whoever it is, your coworker, your dog trainer, your veterinarian, I don't know, insert the person. If they're using Google Messages and they're on an Android device, and you are, for whatever reason, using the green message bubbles on an iPhone, I don't know why, but people do this, right? It's a legitimate thing. you guys are now going to get end-to-end encryption via RCS. So previously we had SMS, which is those green bubbles. We heard recently how Apple is releasing RCS support, which carries things over like reactions and real-time typing indicators, and that's already helped bridge that gap. And now we have the final update, which is finally end-to-end encryption, and it's called encrypted RCS. It has a beta label, and it's supported on a subset of supported cellular carriers that you can find in the show notes if you want to see if this works for you. I do not think this is going to replace Signal. This still has metadata concerns. This is still locked to Apple's messaging app as well as Google Messages. You can't really use this using any other messengers. So for a huge majority of you in our audience, this doesn't even impact you. With that said, this is very important for people in your life who are using SMS, who are using RCS, who would never know otherwise. So I think this kind of bumps the baseline up. This doesn't change anything about the dedicated tools that we commonly recommend back here. So that's how I like to communicate this. I see this kind of similar to what HTTPS did for the web, which is it raised the baseline of security, but it never replaced tools like VPNs or Tor or other dedicated privacy and security tools, just like how I think this raises the baseline. So that is the first update, and it's more of maybe something that you should share with your friends and family. I guess maybe some of you still use this as well. Now, the next story is a little bit more of a traditional open source update here, which is a Linux security update with Debian making reproducible builds mandatory. Is it reproducible, reproducible? I always say reproducible, but just that one time I said reproducible for some reason. I don't know where that came from. There must be there's some voice in my head that's been wanting to say that for years, I guess. But this is pretty cool, guys. It's now a hard requirement for the Debian 14 forky cycle. So since May 9th, the project's migration software has blocked any package failing a reproducibility check from entering testing. This is huge. If you're curious about what reproducibility means, it means that essentially the code that you see on GitHub, you can actually verify is the same code that is running and compiled on your system. Reproducibility is hard. It is so hard to get this to be pulled off. And so I know the amount of work that Debian probably had to go through to make this happen. Tails 7.7.3 was released, and it's an emergency release to fix a critical security vulnerability in the Linux kernel. I wonder what that has to do with, wink, wink. Go back to the highlight story, as well as security vulnerabilities in the Tor browser and in the Tor client. Now, yes, they specifically say dirty frag, and they also mention copy fail to be decided, and we should keep an eye on if that also includes the brand new one that we talked this week, Fragnesia. Either way, if you're on Tails, get that updated ASAP. Up next, this is a very minor update for Signal users. They are now adding security warnings for social engineering and phishing attacks. These are just some new in-app confirmations to just try to give a little bit more awareness towards people out there, or I guess US politicians who add journalists into their Signal groups potentially as well. That's another possible use case for these. But without diving into that rabbit hole, this is just a good, nice update. Apparently, I haven't seen this, but Signal has been saying there's more scammers that are posing as Signal. There's a lot more impersonation happening on the platform. Signal has a lot of great protections in place. It's end-to-end encrypted. It helps protect metadata, but there's very little you can do against social engineering with technology. And so this is their attempt to at least try to warn people, have more pop-ups, and make it a little bit harder for a person who doesn't know what they're doing, or a person who knows what they're doing but just isn't thinking clearly at 2 a.m. in the morning from making a critical mistake. And if you're listening to this and you want to see it, the show notes actually shows you screenshots of what these notifications look like. It has things like safety tips. It has extra things on like, do you really want to accept this request? It shows things like name not verified. And there's a few more warnings and pop-ups just built into the app. It's good stuff. We have another really cool Linux update this week, and it's from Fedora, which is releasing kind of a whole new Linux distro called Fedora Hummingbird, which is a super hardened Linux distribution, which is so cool. So my first question when I read this, which was already addressed actually by the article, it's FOSS, which you can find in the show notes, is what's the difference between this and Fedora Silverblue? But this is a little bit different because this doesn't ship with a desktop environment. It also has its own independent vulnerability tracking and its own life cycle, and it has its own specific features that make it a hardened distro. They say it is currently experimental and not suitable for production use. And again, I think this is for very, very specific use cases. This is not meant to be used by just anybody willy-nilly, but I'm still very excited to see how it develops as time goes on. Next update is from iVPN, which is another one of my favorite VPN providers. They're fully open source, and they now have some plan changes, which include a Plus tier, increased device limits, and additional privacy services. They now have a Plus plan, which includes the same 5 devices, but now it comes with MailX, which is an email aliasing solution that's built in. They also have Mod DNS, which is, I haven't tested it yet, but it sounds like it's something like NextDNS that's also built in automatically. Pro Suite, which is 10 devices. It includes MailX, it includes Mod DNS, and it includes Portmaster Pro, and that goes for $100 a year, $10 a month, or $4 a week. Now, Portmaster Pro, I believe, is what was previously the SPN. So a lot of people might have missed this. I do think we covered it on the podcast, though. iVPN actually acquired the Portmaster tool. Now, Portmaster is this firewall tool. It's open source that you can run locally on Linux and Windows, and it's a great way to pretty much filter out web traffic and see what each app is connecting to, and even block telemetry on Windows. And it's a very powerful tool for your privacy. It gives you a lot of control over your data on your devices. And it also has a feature called the SPN, which I'd say is something in between a VPN and Tor. It's supposed to give you a little bit more of the speed of the VPN, but not quite the same anonymity as Tor, but it blends things in the middle. And so now you also get access to that tool. So yeah, I haven't looked at these tools yet. This is me just covering the news. This is their blog article. Check it out, especially if you're an iVPN customer. This is definitely some interesting stuff. If you guys are interested in me doing a full review and taking a look at this suite, let me know, and that's something I can look into a bit further. And the last update to the week is another little Linux win to round out this new open source section. The Sovereign Tech Fund has invested over €1 million into the KDE software development. They pretty much said, this is a quote, "We are investing in KDE because it is one of the 2 major desktop environments used across Linux and plays a key role in how millions of people experience open technology. Strengthening KDE's testing infrastructure, security architecture, and communication frameworks is how we invest in the resilience and reliability of the core digital infrastructure that modern society depends on." Love to see it. Love to see a little bit more money flowing into the Linux world, and I'm excited to see what they do with that kind of funds. I mean, that's not a small amount of cash, so I hope they can take it far. And that, everybody, is the surveillance report of the week. I always want to remind you out there, if this analysis helped you reclaim control, or you just enjoy the news and you want to keep up with things a little bit better, you can become a Techlorian by visiting the link in the show notes. You're going to get access to our exclusive Signal community, and you also get access to my private RSS feed. I track dozens of different sources every single week, and I tag them in my RSS feed as I go along so that I can actually put these show notes together and record this episode for all of you on Wednesday. And so if you want to track that RSS feed throughout the week as I'm adding those things in, you can get that as well if you become a Techlorian. And that starts at just $5 a month, which is a cup of coffee a month, and it really helps support us back here. If you don't want to support us that way, you can also just leave a rating. You can share this episode with somebody you know. You can give it a like, or you can just share with friends and family one of the stories in the show notes and let them know how they can keep themselves safe. Again, you can also follow this as its own dedicated newsletter down in the description. It is the Surveillance Report newsletter. It is completely free. It is literally just kind of a written TLDR of what I cover on this podcast. So it's pretty much just a written version of my show notes. But I think it's a little bit more digestible if you just need something quicker. And it's especially a little bit more useful for friends and family who aren't going to listen to these longer podcasts. With all that said, I want to thank you all for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of Surveillance Report. Thank you all so much for the journey and for getting us this far, and I'm excited to keep it going even further.